Welcome to Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent, the Lumina Foundation podcast with newsmakers and thought leaders in the field of learning and training after high school. I'm Dakota Palicki, and with me today is my co-host, Dr. Catherine Weedle. Catherine, it is so good to see you today.
Back again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Of course. It's always fun to hang out and get to do this together. And I know that we have a good show in store today. You know, part of your duties at Lumina has been focused on affordability and federal policy. And you and some of our colleagues have led a body of work called The Borrower's Color. And you know, we've heard so much lately about the college affordability issues. We've heard a lot about, student debt and student loans. And so I'm excited because you kind of brought together a show today really focused on this Borrowers of Color work. What are we going to be talking about?
If listeners are new or if you are a returner, you would remember a couple episodes ago, we talked with folks who are really intimate and familiar with federal policy, state policy, and thinking about their hopes and predictions for this year. And so one of those predictions, focus on student debt and affordability, has continued. I think generally folks are asking the question, what does race have to do with student debt? And while we know we have partners out there who are conducting research and a part of the conversation, we know that there are also advocates that are part of the conversation too, to elevate and connect the dots. And so as a foundation focused on post-secondary attainment, focus on making sure that all learning counts and that today's students are represented, we wanted to work with researchers, advocates in their own right to bring their expertise on what we're missing in the current conversation about student loan debt and borrowers of color specifically, and how can we add to the conversation so that there's a little bit more nuance, that the moniker borrowers of color or students of color might be helpful to help move the conversation forward as it comes to racial equity. And so we're really lucky to have worked with 10 extraordinary individuals, our working group members, and having produced a few essays and a larger report on borrowers of color. And for this episode, we're happy to have one of those members of the working group, Dr. Sasheen, who is an assistant professor at the Arizona State University, as well as a research analyst from Unidos US, which is the nation's premier Hispanic and Latino-focused civil rights organization, Amanda Martinez, who does their higher education work there.
Well, that's exciting. I'm really looking forward to talking to both Amandas. I think before we do, though, you've learned so much about this. You already knew a lot about it, of course, but you've learned so much about this through that working group that you mentioned and in collaboration. I think a lot of us have personal stories about student loan debt, and we hear personal stories, and so I think it might be helpful just to start up at a very high level. I mean, give us an understanding of that kind of scope of student debt in the United States and help us bring that into the conversation a bit.
Sure. So student loan debt, the trend overall is that it was a problem that was bad. It got worse, and the cost associated with college now exacerbates the problem. And so what that means is that 45 million Americans have some form of student debt, and the aggregated price tag on that is about $1.6 to $1.7 trillion.
Wow.
Some of that is public, some of that is private, and that's where you see a lot of conversations about policy is mostly connected to the public loans. I would say that the overall trend that people don't know, we don't hear as much in more mainstream media, is that most borrowers owe less than $20,000, and that's according to some research that was published March 2020 as well as in 2016, and that graduates of 2019 left with significantly more debt than their 2004 counterparts. So again, indicating how big the problem is. And I think the important piece is that when you move from the individual to the system, or move from the individual to group, we know that there are racial inequities in outcomes like defaults, repayments, and that usually is indicative of a larger issue that is beyond the choice of the individual, that is beyond solutions like financial literacy and those sorts of interventions. Not that they're not important, not that there shouldn't be concerted efforts and very clear efforts to communicate information to borrowers, but there's a larger issue going on, and we're really lucky to have learned from the members of the working group, as well as from their essays and today's conversation.
And I know that, through a lot of this conversation, there was a lot of really good new research and facts and figures and kind of giving people the data and factual understanding of the current landscape for student debt. But what I really appreciated too, in addition to all that kind of factual information, being someone who really latches onto stories a little bit more, y'all did a whole lot of work too about exploring kind of like the actual truths of things and some of the misconceptions that people have, particularly at that intersection between student loan and race. I think you call it truth and tropes. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. We wanted to call out not just a need for more research, better research, clearer research, research that's focused on specific communities, but calling out where narratives tend to trip us up, or calling out where narratives are creating an idea of who the borrower is that is not necessarily connected to evidence. I think one of the larger communities, or more the communities that come to play when you talk about borrowers of color, are Black student loan borrowers. And some of the things we hear, I don't think are completely intended, but they're rooted in ideas that are connected to anti-Blackness. And those ideas show up in systems that drive disparities in education. I'm really grateful to Doctors Dominique Baker and Fenaba Addo for their work and their essays and their general talking about borrowers of color, Black borrowers specifically, because they call out some of the things that are really important, like the idea that Black borrowers do not want to repay or are choosing not to repay, the idea of if you take a loan out, then you pay it back, without looking at the evidence of that. There's no real strong evidence, or little, that supports some of the ideas that surround Black graduates. But we know that Black adults over 50 are more likely than their white peers to hold student debt. We know that Black graduates face discrimination, unequal employment opportunities, and fewer career advancement opportunities that would increase their income to pay back the debt. And there's longstanding policies that have denied wealth building to Black communities that now would have made it more affordable for students and members of their family to attend. I think one of the things that folks tend to miss when it comes to Black borrowers too is that African-American women hold the heaviest debt loads, but also because of the wage and income discrimination, tend to pay more out of their income monthly towards student loans. And that the principal and interest aren't necessarily being paid down for Black borrowers in comparison to white borrowers. So there's a systemic issue, and racist tropes added to the conversation only puts borrowers in a position to not have really clear advocacy. And I think that's where the advocates are really important to help dispel some myths. And our two Amandas today are going to dive a little deeper into what those tropes and misconceptions look like for Latino students and Native students.
Mm. So I'm eager to get to that conversation too. I guess before you and I leave, though, I think there's one other conversation about the student loan and debt issues that do come up quite a bit. which is this issue of default. I mean, you and I have both heard this a lot about, well, it's really the individual's fault. There's a lot of labeling the individual consumer, saying, well, they shouldn't have taken out so much debt if they couldn't have repaid it back. But I know you and your colleagues, as part of the working group, as part of the Borrowers of Color kind of report and collection, also addressed that. Do you have any high-level kind of findings that might be helpful for us before we start talking to our two guests?
Sure. So the overall trend for default rates, though default rates on federal loans have declined over time, which is good, repayment rates are also going down, which means there are fewer borrowers making progress in repaying their loans entirely. We know that federal loan default rates are highest amongst borrowers with low balances, which is why it's really important to keep in mind that 20,000 or less amount, that it's not necessarily those who are in the higher bracket of loan debt. However, that's really important for Black borrowers, because Black borrowers, Latino borrowers, Native borrowers overall tend to borrow more and have more need as a result of not having as much wealth or other resources available. Half of Black borrowers who entered college in 2003-2004 academic year defaulted on their loans within 12 years, compared to 20% of white borrowers. And I think one of the things that's most shocking to me, amongst the lots of data that's out there about student loan borrowing, is that a Black borrower with a college degree is more likely to default on their loan than a white borrower without a degree. That is a sign of something deeper going on that we need to understand, both in practice and how policy, state, institutional, and federal policy need to be more responsive to the issues at hand.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot to unpack, and I'm really glad that you got our two great guests with us today to help us unpack that and bring more bring more information here. And again, we'll just say at the top, this is all part of the Borrowers of Color work. There's some really great, articles and videos and webinars that are on Lumina's website. You can find them in our show notes. So for those who are looking to dig deeper on anything that we're talking about today, definitely go check those resources. But, Catherine, I think we're ready to jump in. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right, let's go meet our guests.
So today we have Dr. Amanda Sasheen, who is an assistant professor of higher education at the Arizona State University. We're really grateful to have Amanda's perspective. I've been a big fan of her work, both in practice and in research, and focus on Native students. So Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. And I'm a big fan of you too, Dr. Catherine Whittle. It's just a joy to be in conversation with you today.
Oh, enough of the fangirl. Dakota, come on in. We're fans of your work too at Civic Lab.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, friends. This sounds like a great conversation. So let's jump on in. Catherine, lead us through this conversation today.
Sure. So I think one of the most interesting and important parts of your work, Amanda, and your focus is elevating the voices of Native students. You've been a part of Lumina's and my part of a journey in better understanding racial equity and affordability, and really calling to question, what do we know, understand, and believe about how Native students access and pay for higher education. So just from a big picture standpoint, tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and how you enter into talking about college affordability.
Absolutely. Well, let me begin by introducing myself in Navajo. She'eya Amanda Tachini and Shia Nanisht as a Tachini Nishlok as a Sana Bashichin, Trabaha Dashiche Ado Ashia Dashinala, Lok Antianasha, Kot Ego Ea Zanen Nishle. And the reason why I introduce myself the way I've always been raised to do so, it actually really situates why I do the research I do. What I shared with you all is my clans, my 4 clans. I'm a Navajo citizen from the Navajo Nation, and we're a matrilineal society, which I feel is really beautiful to come from a long standing of matriarchs in my family. And many of them are educators. My mom has been a long time, she's retired now, but she was a teacher and a counselor, and I grew up helping her, back then we had chalkboards, and I grew up cleaning the chalkboards and helping her in the classroom and just following her around in the school setting. And she taught back in our hometown where I was raised, Lukanskia, which also my introduction means the patch of wide reeds. And then my grandmother, I give her a lot of credit to her too. She wasn't a credentialed nurse in a Western sense, but she knew how to take care of people, and she knew medicinal ways of our, from our knowledge system. And she was often called in to be a nurse at our school because nurses in a rural reservation would come and go. They weren't consistent. And there would be periods of months where we didn't have a, quote unquote certified nurse. And my grandma, I remember her used to get called in to take care of us. And I used to sneak away and go hang out with her at during lunch period because my grandma was just so beautiful and kind. So a lot of what I do today is really, I feel, a reflection of a continuing the legacy of my grandmother and my mother. And so in terms of college affordability, growing up also in a rural reservation on Navajo Nation, we lived paycheck to paycheck. And sometimes now that I'm an adult, I often think about my mom and how much she sacrificed for me to get a college degree, but also recognize the impoverished conditions that our people are in. Now, I want to be careful with that illustration because when I grew up, I didn't see it as such. It was just, everything was just beautiful in the way in which you're raised back at home on Navajo. But it isn't until you start seeing and understanding as you grow the systemic challenges that are facing my people. And so really then started to understand more so how college affordability really inhibits my relatives to get a college degree. So really that's the start of my story, is really connecting and reflecting and being a part of the system and trying to make it.
And since then, you've had opportunities to not only do research as an assistant professor, but doing so in different areas, working directly with students. What do affordability and debt issues look like specifically for Native students? And how are they connected to the broader story of Native students in American higher education?
Yeah, I want to be cautious when I speak about Native issues. As you alluded to in the beginning, not many people know that we are still in existence today. And this is grounded in empirical research. Recently, Reclaiming Native Truth in 2018 did a really amazing empirical research look at the general public and their views on Native folks. And as many of us as Native people already knew to be true, the general public thinks we are historicized or we are no longer here. And so I'm sharing that kind of broader view because then when you hear someone like me talking about Native issues, we tend to generalize that this is the experience of all Native people in this nation state, when there are 574 federally recognized tribes, more state recognized tribes, and more tribes trying to find legitimacy and also become recognized. And I share those big numbers because there's distinction and variance and nuances within our people. And Navajo, and because I'm from the Navajo Nation, even our tribe is one of the largest now. We just learned after COVID that our numbers increased. And so with COVID, we're still as many of you know, working through that. So I share that because I want to be cautious, but what I share is not just there's multi views in how I look at this. So when it comes to college affordability, many of our communities are low income. They come from communities with high poverty rates and high unemployment rates. These are just national statistics that demonstrates how then college affordability is extremely difficult for those families who are just trying to make ends meet. And so with the recent increase in tuition, particularly after the Great Recession, we saw the enrollment numbers of our Native students dramatically drop. So let me kind of give some numbers to contextualize what I'm saying. So in 2009, there was about 205,900 Native students enrolled in four-year degree institutions. And that was one of the highest numbers we've seen in history. And then 2016, our numbers plummeted to 129,000. that was the lowest since 2000. And we are still not yet at the levels that we were gaining. And it's 2000, it's 20 years ago. So we're talking, and we know in that time frame between 2009 to 2016 is when the Great Recession occurred. And what happens with institutions? They increase many institutions were not getting the federal and state policy support that they were accustomed to, so they raise tuition. And often then what happens is people like Native people are left out of college because of the cost is just so extreme. And our enrollment numbers reflects that. And so then for Native students, if the students who do attend college in 2005 and 16, 87% of Native full-time undergrads received some form of grant aid. Now that's a lot of students, right? So it speaks to the amount of need that is necessary. And then for those who do graduate with a 4-year degree, these are Native students, 76% borrow to pay for college, averaging a debt of $26,380 in student loan debt. Now, these are the numbers of students who graduate. There are many, many more that don't and are graduating with debt as well. And that's troubling because it maintains the status quo of income equality, wealth generation, home owning, all of these different markers that we see in our society as, economic successful as contributing to it. So college affordability for Native students, then if we look at those numbers, the more that we increase tuition and college, the likelihood that our Native students will continue to decrease in enrollment and continue to persist and get a graduate degree. Also, it would also mean more debt amongst a population that have been for centuries trying to make ends meet, trying to get into an economic place of, in our community, we use the term survivance, which is survival and thriving.
Mm-hmm. We appreciate you putting together and really laying out all of the research and the details that we know that the majority of Native students are need-based or are seeking some type of student loans to cover the full cost. I think what has been really impactful for me in my work and hearing you and others from Lumina's working group on borrowers of color are exploring some of the tropes that we don't necessarily know are at play and then impact what we think about borrowers of color, what we think about policy. Could you share a couple of things of the misconceptions and the myths about Native students, how they access and pay for college?
So one of the myths or tropes that is damaging for Native communities that we wrote about in our essays are actually two things. One is connected to what I said earlier of this idea of invisibility, like this idea we're not here. And so that has very damaging implications when Natives are not included in data, are not included in the consciousness, and then they're not included in policy making, program development, and so forth. That is, there was an article that was written by Teen Vogue where the title is Invisibility is the Modern Form of Racism, which speaks to the level of erasure that is hurting our people. Connected to that is the other flip side is there's hypervisibility. This idea that what people do know about us is really centered on stereotypes and these myths that are ongoing. And so Brian Brayboy and I wrote a piece and we talk about the ways in which myths continue to be shared over and over and over again to become then truths, which is really scary if you think about it. So the myths regarding affordability is this idea that Natives go to college for free. And this is rooted into these larger narratives that that we wrote about from the Reclaiming Native Truth that found the general public views that Natives are living off the government and are getting rich off the casino. So these ideas of Natives are just, lazy people who are unable to care for themselves and just benefit off of the government are false narratives that are rooted in histories old of Natives being savages, unintelligent, and therefore unable to take care of the land, which then gives the reasons for land disposition and stolen of theft of land that continues today. So then those old myths are rooted centuries old, and this idea of college is free. Then people are assuming that I'm not supporting natives to look for scholarships, not talk. And then native students also internalize, oh, I heard that college is free for us. Come to find out, it is not. And we have this challenge that I shared earlier of high debt, high loan, and inability to continue because of lack of funding. And so this myth of Native goes to college for free is damaging, and it really needs to stop. And I'm glad we wrote about that in this essay.
Well, and Amanda, I mean, I just, when we juxtapose the data that you presented earlier, that, over 80% of Native students are attending an institution, that, upon completion, just talking about those who complete a 4-year degree, I think the stat was the, average debt is more than $26,000. And so just stacking that against this notion that, they must all go to college for free and they're living off the government dime. I mean, like, any listener should just stick those two data points and stick them right next to each other. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who, a lot of people who walk away from school with debt, but, perhaps not as high as that number, let alone thinking they might have, missed out. It's kind of the zero-sum thinking again. So I just think that's an incredibly pivotal point here that you're making.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think what's the crux in that, and the reason why I study affordability, is the land conversation. And so the tensions around that is that the history knows that this land that we are all benefiting on, the beauty that we see right now, was once indigenous land. And universities also are benefiting from this land. So there was a really great report from Tristan Antone and Bobby Lee titled Land Grab Universities, which actually revealed that the moral act that has been lauded as the act that provided higher education for the public was granted seed money for these land grant institutions. Well, the money that was the seed money is from this idea of public lands. But public lands, the history is that land actually was stolen from indigenous people and then given out to institutions now many of these institutions are benefiting in perpetuity off of these endowments. And so then if you think about then juxtapose, like, our Native students are not entering college, and then the lands that their ancestors were stripped away from them in their own homelands, they're garnering money still for universities, and increase in tuitions going up. And then there's these pervasive myths that are occurring. It's just the stacks are against Natives in terms of trying to really see what the truth is in these histories, and then getting our people into college. And so that's why I'm really talking about this here too, is there's real truth underlining connected to land, tribal sovereignty, and college affordability.
I think what's really unique and important to call out is that one's Native identity is also a political identity. And part of that is its connection to treaties and how the federal government should interact with the 574 recognized tribes. I think, adding that in policymaking and proposals and the myth busting, what are some things that advocates, policymakers, practitioners should know about Native students as the conversation about affordability continues to be of national interest?
I feel like this is the great question that I'm so grateful we wrote this essay with Chris Nelson and Jameson Lopez, because we often get this question, and it's so hard to say, like, what's one or two takeaways, from what we're sharing, because there's so much that needs to be addressed. And so what we wrote in an essay was really just this idea of, let's have data inclusion to really understand, to move away from this invisibility notion that I just addressed. And I think that's really important, is to have data inclusion that's accurate, reliable at a federal, state, tribal, and institutional level. And also that data is led by Native scholars or Native community members, because I think what's important for us to understand is some of the data that is often gathered is questions or variables that we as Native people may not want to know. Like we may want to know different information. So we want data that's rooted and guided by data folks. And so the term that I've heard many Native scholars use is we want data sovereignty to really generate what is important for our people to thrive and continue to thrive. And so that's important. The other thing I want to mention is that, I know there's conversations about free tuition, especially in this climate that we're in. And that's really exciting for us because some of us have been talking about this for some time now, given the complexities and the intersections that I just alluded to of land disposition, tribal sovereignty, and college affordability amongst Native people. But in the essay, what we're talking about is that it has to move beyond tuition-free models. It needs to be thoughtful because it's the cost of housing, it's the cost of a living, it's the cost of transportation, it's having a campus environment that is understanding of my ways of knowing. So it's support services that are culturally aware and sustaining. So really tuition free is a Band-Aid. It really doesn't get to the systemic and the structural issues that are needed to really support Native students. So we're talking about really thinking about what do we need to do to support Native students, given the history of this nation state, given the history of our people, to really help the first people of this place.
So, one question I have, just based on what you're just sharing, Amanda, is, we've talked with a number of guests on the show a number of times, and we've talked about the need for, addressing the affordability crisis in higher ed, particularly on the grant and student aid side of things. But, when you're talking about the systems, it has to go beyond tuition. We're talking about the other expenses that, any learner of any age incurs while going after a higher education. I guess I'm curious to get your thoughts, too, about the cost side of things. We can talk about the policy solutions to, addressing financial aid and making access a little bit more prevalent, but costs continue to rise. Even in one institution I'm affiliated with, they said, "Hey, we froze tuition, but we have to raise housing expenses by 3% this year." And so, I guess I'm curious, do you have any specific thoughts or advice to policymakers or institutional leaders who are looking to try to address things on the cost side of the house? How can institutions reduce cost rather than us just continuing to find new solutions to increase support?
Yeah, I think cost is always going to be something that institutions and folks working in policy are going to look at. It's important. One of the things that I think we need to better examine is the monies that are generated from land disposition, and not only just the land, but the minerals, because I feel like if we were to really look at cost breakdown, we should examine what that looks like and see how much money institutions are benefiting, not only from the land, but also that they are generating from tribal nations. Many people do not know that tribes give money every year to institutions, like millions of dollars in some institutions. And that's knowledge that people are unaware of. And tribes don't only give it to institutions, they give it to state governments. They give a lot of funding out. And so it would be interesting to see how much money is generated from land and from tribal people to get a sense of what is already provided. I think too, and this is going to probably be a little bit more, it's hard, I don't know if hard is the accurate term, but I think institutions need to also think about the ways in which they are spending money that is damaging the land. And I say that because, I am an institution in the desert and I love the beauty of the place, and we are using a lot of water and with lawns and beautiful manicured lawns. And although I understand it's important to have a great looking environment for institutions, but my concern is how much money are we wasting in that? And also, what is that doing to harm our world right now, given our climate challenges that we are facing? So I think there's those type of internal questions I think institutions can reflect upon is what are some things that we're doing that could not only help students, but also help the future of this land. And so my thinking is kind of moving in that direction too. But I'm not an expert on infrastructure and cost benefit analysis at an institutional level. I'm coming in from just kind of a lens of looking at Native students, but also being a community member from this place, from this land, and really thinking about the longevity of this place. I want my grandchildren to be able to go to university and drink water, in generations future. So I think I'm coming in from that lens.
I think those are both very reasonable goals for our grandchildren to be able to get the kind of education they need, and as well as have access to water and thrive and prosper on our planet. And I think what you're reminding me of too here is that there's really opportunities for some unique configurations of allies to go after issues of affordability on college campuses, as well as environmental sustainability. And, certainly as we're looking at different communities around the country, there are more coalitions building around both of those affiliated goals, looking at the kinds of things that we're spending and doing to the land or to the built environment, physical environment, that may have a negative impact on the environment overall. And as well as how do we then recoup those savings that might be gained from either stopping or doing something differently and put it towards our goal of better student success. So I think it's a poignant reminder of for a lot of those folks who are trying to make change in these areas to find strange bedfellows and other allies that might not be so steeped in education issues. And Amanda, I just want to say thank you for your continued scholarship and all your work that you're doing. And, even for my own self-study, it's been a real pleasure to read some of your writing, to certainly read the great work and your contributions to Lumina's Borrowers of Color initiative. And Catherine, thank you so much for bringing Amanda to our show today.
Oh, anytime. Dr. Amanda Sasheen, thank you so much for your work, and check her out.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate this time. Y'all take care.
Hey everyone, welcome back. So glad you're sticking with us. We're looking forward to continue our conversation today about borrowers of color. Catherine, you have another really great guest in store for us today. Who'd you bring into the studio today?
Yes, in this case, this is our second Amanda, top two, but never number two. Amanda Martinez is a research analyst at Unidos US. And I'm really excited to have her. She has done quite a bit of research focused on Latino students and families, and can provide some insights on what debt and affordability looks like for Latino families.
That's great. Hey, Amanda, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you all for having me. I'm excited about our conversation today.
Well, thank you for joining us. So I gave just a little bit about who you are and how you're connected to this work. Could you share a little bit about yourself, Unidos, and where do you enter into this broader conversation about affordability in college students?
First, I'm a daughter of Mexican and Ecuadorian immigrant parents who really instilled the value of education and showed me what it's like to be resilient in different life circumstances, whether that be in the highs of life or the lows of life. And I think that story continues to be this constant theme, even in my current work at Unidos. So I'm a first generation college student. I went to a Hispanic serving institution. I'm the product of public higher education. And really, I consider myself lucky because one misstep in my higher education journey that would have potentially derailed not just in my life, but impacted my family's life and economic stability. But yet when I, started to, again, I feel very privileged to be able to be a research analyst or policy analyst at Unidos US, which is the nation's largest civil rights organization fighting on the behalf of the Latino community. It started in the 1960s, so we have roots in, there's a historical perspective there for trying to combat discriminatory policies and trying to help advance the Latino community and build upon our empowerment in political systems and our economic empowerment. As I started my work there, because this was a very personal issue, I wanted to fight on behalf of my community because I saw the struggles continue in my daily life or in my friends or family's life. I found that my story continues to be not unique.
Well, we appreciate the work that Unidos has done and continues to do with others in the federal policy space, and the uniqueness and importance of being connected to affiliate networks, community members, families, students of all ages, to be able to represent those unique perspectives. I think what's really important, though, is that connecting the personal to the research, and you're having that experience and that knowledge. So I guess big picture, what do affordability and debt issues look like for Latino students, and how are they connected to the broader story of Latino students in American higher education?
Yeah, so I would say the story of affordability for Latino students, and then how it relates to current student debt issues. Before I kind of go into like the data of like the affordability gap and access issues, and even workforce disparity issues or just completion issues, I do want to like kind of take a step back and recognize or pause that there's a historical point to be made. I think originally during this 1965, when the HEA Act, or the Higher Education Act, because that's an acronym, and not those who know the acronym don't really know.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, not everyone knows. In 1965, I think there was this vision and this like reckoning in the country that recognized the power of education, the power of building up the lower and middle class, and that higher education was a way to securing economic mobility for lower income or medium income families. And so there was this huge push for investment. But I think when that was made, maybe they didn't really think people were going to actually take up that call. And they were like, we'll do this, but I don't think anyone could have predicted that Latinos or Black students and families would say, wow, thank you for that call. I'm going to take that up, and they're going to drive it. It was like the best motivation, and it drove behavior. Unfortunately, policymakers at those times really didn't, I don't think, understood the nuance of the populations that would take up that call. So they didn't really understand that Latinos are coming from mixed immigration status families, are coming from not predominantly English dominated families, are coming from families who, for the first time, maybe are experiencing different experiences in our financial market when it comes to loan products, predatory loan products, unbanking system, not understanding maybe that, when you take on debt or credit, that there's long-term economic consequences if you don't really understand or navigate that system. And on top of that, more recently, I would say like a recent kind of other like historical shift was just the 2008 recession, which really hit Latino families and students extremely hard. And then you have the recent COVID, epidemic or pandemic, and that is just this like not that far of a layer that's then again double hit 2 generations, maybe 3 generations, I would argue, of economic, educational gains lost. And any type of recovery that was potentially being made after 2008 for the Latino community, it was barely being seen like in 2019. And then we did not really get any grace. Like there was just good luck on recovering for the next 50 years of our lives. But I would like to say some hope in the narrative, in that we've seen that despite higher education being extremely, housed in a very discriminatory and structure of our nation, and racist structure of our nation, Latinos still have somehow used their resiliency and used their fight to survive to somehow navigate through all those difficult barriers presented within higher education system in itself, and the other external environment factors that they have to deal with. So that was a very large, extended background of like the framing, but basically college is not affordable for Latinos. So in simple terms, college is not affordable. The affordability gap is probably the widest for Latinos compared to their white counterparts. And so when I say the affordability gap is large, I mean that after we looked at data in 2016 data, which is the most accurate that we have, after accounting for federal, state aid, or federal need-based aid and state-based aid, after accounting for that, Latino families have to pay more in college expenses. And when I say college expenses, it's not just tuition, it's non-tuition costs. So you kind of like look at it more holistically. But that gap compared to their white counterparts is larger. And so what do? There's only so much so to like, how do we fill this gap? Because they're going to fill the gap somehow in some way. So what we see is that Latinos afford that gap through not just loans, even though it's a large myth that Latinos are debt averse. While that's somewhat true, it's nuanced. And now college is becoming so expensive, but also necessary to building a potential pathway to the middle class, that Latinos are taking out loans and their families are taking out loans. But they're also piecing together a bunch of different resources to make up that gap every single year that they decide to enroll in college.
You know, Amanda, something I really appreciate, what I think I hear you saying is that when we're talking about college affordability and the particular issues that people of color and students of color have related to borrowing, related to addressing the affordability gap, you know, the way you framed your conversation is saying, listen, it's not a single thing, it's a systems thing. It is much broader. We can't just be talking about student aid. We can't just be talking about loan forgiveness or loan accessibility. We do need to be talking about the additional expenses beyond tuition. We do need to be talking about immigration status. We do need to be talking about how language is used and language competency is used to deny people access into the American higher education system. So I appreciate you calling attention to that it is really a systems thing. And for me, what I hear, building on your kind of moment of hope here, is that just means there's a lot of room for a lot of folks to get involved. And I think, we've heard this through some other guests in this show today too, that there's potential to make unique coalitions of people and organizations that are interested in similar goals, but wanting to get there through their own particular way. And I got to imagine that your work at Uninos gives you an opportunity to work with some of these pretty interesting coalitions towards common goals.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's probably my favorite part of my job is that, I knew this as a student. It was very natural for me to know that, in 2017, when the previous president rescinded DACA, that affected 900 people at my university, and I knew them. Wow. They were my family, they were my friends, and they were my colleagues. Not only that, they affected even some of the faculty members or those who were providing academic or non-academic supports for our Dream Center, which is a center specifically to help undocumented students navigate their way through the higher ed system. I knew them. So it was very clear to me through my own personal experience. And it's also very clear through our own research with our affiliates who are community-based organizations serving these, the Latino community and various aspects of their lives, not just helping them with their applying to college, but helping them figure out the healthcare system, helping them figure out their immigration status and how they can live in that state with or without, papers, or helping them on their way to pathway to citizenship. So you are right. It was very natural for me to view everything from an intersectional lens. And then when I came to DC and started working, I realized the lack of intersectionality and the lack of coalitions coming together, or issues realizing, wait, an individual person is more than just one of their identities. They hold multiple at the same time, and our bodies are filtering through different systems, yes, maybe at different times, but that doesn't mean the other ones go away just miraculously. But I love that you pointed out that there's also hope in the sense that more people can come together, and more of our issues are actually bringing unity instead of divisiveness, because that's ultimately all the different coalitions shouldn't just be one issue area, but we should be coming together and realize, okay, you can focus on this part of the person, you focus on this part of the person, but we all need to understand and come together.
I think we do want to go back to, you had told some kind of interesting stories at the beginning of your framing too. And it just goes down to, some of the models that we know that include, that speak to how to actually create systems change. And one of those things is shifting mental models of people. That people have about various issues or other groups of people. And so, through the work with the Lumina Borrowers of Color initiative, I know that you looked into some of the misconceptions that might exist around how Latino students do or do not pay for education. You've already talked about some of them, about, being loan, one of the misconceptions being loan adverse, for example, or a variety of other things. But I guess I'm just go a level up. And what do you think motivates some of these biases, particularly among, the policymakers and other folks that you are trying to speak to?
I think the first one, so there's two things that came up to me when you asked me this question. I think the first one that right away my gut says to try to explain why maybe policymakers or scholars like to just throw out this solution or this explanation for why Latinos borrow at low rates or don't borrow or aren't borrowers or shouldn't be a part of the borrower conversation, is that I think scholars and academics like to simplify problems to communities they aren't informed about. And they like to take theory and just say, well, this explains the behavior, so let's just attach this term. It makes it simple. It makes it a simple talking point. I think humans like to have simplicity with complex problems, especially if you are far away from the issue or you're not specifically impacted by it. It's very easy to just put a name to something. And unfortunately, I think that name has power and has actually influenced some of our community's thoughts about themselves. There's another narrative that's out there that, Latinos don't complete. And while in the data, it's true that we do have the largest or the widest college completion gap, so it's, we do struggle to complete college. What's lacking in that conversation is it puts the burden on the individual versus shifting the conversation for the system. And so in explaining debt aversion, we need to be nuanced in understanding that story and understanding that it can change, and it currently is constantly changing. So first I'll speak to the debt aversion research that we've done. We did research with the University of North Carolina, and we specifically studied, because of the college completion gap and wondering whether or not if students did take on student debt, what would that mean? Their outcome could have been different. And what we found with Latino students who had some college but no degree, the answer was nuanced. They said that there was a bunch of family expectations and concerns that really drove their decision to stop out of college, or family, concerns about family financial security that also played into whether or not they wanted to take on a certain amount of debt or debt at all. External environmental factors really became the most prominent reason for their inability to complete. So it's it's not just this single area that can just fix someone's problem. These are people's lives. They're managing their family, they're managing themselves. They're the first in their family to try to navigate a college system. They're trying to be academic advisors to themselves. They're trying to be advisors, financial counselors to their parents. So they carry on a lot of hats, and the system or the institutions in which they're enrolling do not really provide them with this wraparound supports to address all those things. So while maybe the college student of yesterday, not the college student of today, has more likely is coming from a family who did attend college, then they have their family to support them in that technical or kind of cultural understanding. And then when they go to college, they probably came from better economically financed, high schools, or had more access to prep programs and all those types of resources that kind of help them navigate the academic culture. Also, most faculty on people's campuses are white. Like there's not a gap. So like when you have a Latino student going into an institution that doesn't understand them at all or understands their background, that's also a barrier. So the debt aversion narrative is nuanced. People like to just put simple things.
Going back to the point about the non-completion or non-completers, and there not being as much nuance and possibly in the policy research papers that can explain or can bring in that relevant context for completion. It makes me think about the institutional types that Latino students enroll, right? You mentioned being an alumna of an HSI and thinking about where do Latino students begin their post-secondary journeys, where do community colleges come in and out? So I'm wondering in your research, where do institutional types come in? Absolutely for the practice, but what do you share with policymakers and their staff about what policy can do about the institutional type?
Yeah, that's, I would also say largely that Latinos are overrepresented. The data shows at two-year community colleges and for-profit colleges. So that's an important also understanding and context that needs to be understood by policymakers or just the general public. And again, I would say that overrepresentation at those types of colleges or those routes that Latinos tend to most likely take is, again, maybe not necessarily their first choice. Mm-hmm. For-profit colleges are known to be, not all of them, but are known to be predominantly, and there's research out there, have heavy marketing and predatory practices. They know where to go. They know how to provide hope. They know how to, in the beginning, enroll students who are disenfranchised and looking for a way out to attain that promise that, again, the HEA, Higher Education Act, was supposed to promise to everyone through public university systems. But yet it seems like almost the for-profit colleges have kind of turned that and saw that hope and value and have turned it on its head. And but also community colleges, there's so much opportunity there too, because they're so close to different community types and are like provide an option for Latino students to be close to their family. They do provide a lot for Latino students, but at the same time, as Catherine, you mentioned, they're underfunded. They don't have staff capacity. Maybe they need additional technical support in their different programs or program types to really serve those students well so that they can actually complete maybe in 4 years or less than maybe like what we're seeing is like 6 or 8 years. I mean, if you take that long, that's fine, but also there's a financial cost to those things and we don't want additional financial costs coming to our community. So we're just mindful of that. But again, I think those options, like Latinos, when we've talked to them, they feel that they weren't given many options to choose from. which is a sign of, again, like the system not being, excluding them from different options or different affordable options. So we want to figure out how to reform the education system so that Latinos do have more than two options to go to. They have a plethora of options that can help them achieve all their educational and career goals in the time that they want to. But I think another important aspect is that Hispanic serving institutions do serve a large swath of Latinos, and that's again due to history. Hispanic serving institutions receive that identity due to population. If an institution has a specific Latino population that reaches about 25% of their population, then they're designated. But that's just a formula. Like, what does that really mean? You could just enroll students. There's nothing else that the federal government asks of them to see what else makes them such a great HSI. And I would even argue that Latino students actually make the HSIs. I'm not sure how much HSIs make Latino students. And some HSIs actually, we should celebrate them. And I would say like my HSI experience was great, but also I saw a lot of gaps and could have been improved. Yet my HSI was probably one of the most renowned HSIs in the country. And so that's speaking to a lot. But Latinos who attend HSIs often have higher completion rates than non-HSIs. So that's saying something. But I want more for my community. I want to be elevated. We want elevation for high-performing HSIs. But definitely HSIs, I think, can provide a good model for the rest of the higher education sector on how to produce good outcomes for Latinos, how to target institutional supports, both academic and non-academic. HSIs really do, some of them have really good models. I know Excelencia has a seal which has specific components to identify which HSIs produce part of their program, what in their program really helps Latino students. So I think looking at those models and elevating those and providing money and investments to HSIs who have proven track records of what programs and institutional targeted supports work, we should boost them up, and then the rest of the sector should follow.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned that. Back in April 2019, it was just shortly after we launched the show. I think it was episode 6. We did a whole show talking about living up to the HSI designation and what it would take for institutions to do that. And, in preparation for today's call, I went back and kind of re-listened to some of that really great content. There's some great guests there. And, they talk about some of the things that we're talking about in the national discourse today about what are some other outcomes and outputs, certain metrics that could be used both at a federal kind of policy level when it comes to making resource allocation decisions. But then you also mentioned Excelencia's seal of Excelencia, the seal. What I can't remember the exact word of it. I'm getting stuck in the loop here. But that really do include some of those metrics that we're particularly caring about, not only in terms of completion, but also about loans, debt, the debt load, et cetera. So it's a great show to go back and brush up on. It's certainly germane to a lot of what you're talking about. So thanks for plugging an old show. Who knows? It's always nice when we can plug an old show. Well, this has been a really great conversation. Catherine, do you have anything else before we move on?
No, I just want to say thank you again to Amanda for your insights, your expertise, and sharing that with us and our listeners. I also want to go through and say Excelencia seal of excellence.
Thank you.
Say that 5 times fast.
I knew it was on the tip of my tongue.
But please go ahead and check out Unidos US and all of his research and policy priorities on Latino students in higher education. Amanda, thank you again for joining us.
Wow. Catherine, that was a lot of information, but some really, really good perspectives. How are you feeling?
Yeah, the issue is nuance. That's the word I keep coming back to. And I know that is not sexy for all of us, but I think in a time when there's a lot of misinformation, mistrust, where we are struggling to communicate and learn about and from one another, I think nuance is exactly what we need. And I'm really grateful to, again, the work of myself and my colleagues, Terry Taylor, Wayne Talfero, and the members of the working group for really taking on the opportunity to engage in some public conversation about race. And I think it connects to Lumina's larger goal of helping others to discuss race in the context of higher education.
Yeah, I think that, that nuance piece is so important too. I mean, you know me well enough that I tend to think on a local and regional level. And, nuance is just so hard to do at a federal policy level. And I think that's one of the things I'm walking away from is that, listen, there are a lot of really good ideas that we must pursue in order for us to achieve our collective goals as a country, and there are reasonable proposals out there that talk about canceling student debt. There are reasonable proposals out there that talk about changing the eligibility standards for federal aid that goes to institutions depending on their outcomes, depending on their structure, et cetera, however people want to do that. But, like you said, that nuance still has to happen. We still need to find a way to support specific communities and give, communities and experts the power and opportunities they need to address some of these challenges and provide some of that nuance. And, sometimes I think we try to solve some of these issues, perhaps not looking at things collectively and all working together, but instead taking one big swing. And I think for me, that's one of the things I'm almost nervous about is that we're in a moment now where we might make some progress at the federal level on addressing the student debt crisis. But, what have we seen? We've just seen college, prices continue to rise. We've seen, a lot of these troubling kind of, metrics on this kind of rise over the case of time. So we know it's going to take more than just one big old solution. And I think your word there, nuance, is exactly right. It's exactly right.
Yeah, we get the opportunity to engage and hopefully influence the general public conversation. So I think what's been really rewarding for me beyond the production of the work is to engage other borrowers of color, myself having student loans, and helping those folks think differently about how they tell themselves, how can we alleviate shame and guilt for borrowers so that they are open to more information and taking on, the individual responsibility that they have. But it's also helping to inform advocates who see that there are many different connecting points to higher education, right? Social mobility, the idea that if you get a degree, then you're able to take care of yourself and your family. And if you're unable to do that because it's unaffordable, then there continues to be these roadblocks. And there's the larger question of how much can American higher education be that equalizer or accelerate social mobility across race and social classes. So I don't think it's a little thing. And you're absolutely right. The federal policy can do one thing, but it's a blunt tool, it's a blunt instrument. Institutions and particularly states also play a major role in college affordability.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing I'm walking away with too is the opportunity to say, we can make progress on this in a number of areas. And one of the areas is by addressing some of the tropes that exist within this world. And the findings in the Borrowers of Color report and other essays that have been produced as around it provides some of this insight on where these tropes come from and how we might be able to address it. We talked with Amanda Martinez about some of the strange bedfellows that we might be able to take on, and knowing that there are a lot of people who want to be part of this conversation, even if they themselves are not debt experts. But there are people who can roll up their sleeves and help address some of the tropes and where they come from, knowing that, quite frankly, they're based in a lot of just, structural racism and a lot of this, a lot of things that we're trying to address as a country right now. This is one of the ways that those conversations manifest.
That's right. And I think that's why we ended with 5 recommendations to better support and serve students of color. Again, Lumina is not necessarily weighing in on what policy should be, but more of honing in and saying, if we're concerned about today's students, if we know we want to increase completion and we know that affordability is a major barrier, let's talk about, and again, connect the dots between race, social, historical context, and policy. And so, those 5 recommendations for us is improving affordability. And I hear folks talk about anti-racist policy or restorative and reparative policy, but policy doesn't do that unless we're very intentional. Policy doesn't do that unless we have coalitions and have folks behind that. And so I think that's an important intentionality, but the follow through is even more important. We have to invest in institutions that serve students of color. And I think that's where the institutional and state policy can come in and play a major role about how much we're investing in institutions like community colleges, open access institutions, minority serving institutions, specifically the TCUs, HBCUs, those who have lower endowments. We know regional publics. We know those are the economic, social mobility drivers in the higher education system. And so if we care about the majority of students, low-income students, first-gen students of color, then we need to care about the institutions that they attend. We have to address racial disparities by considering how debt may be forgiven. Again, not weighing in on the open proposals, but there's a there, and I'll leave it at that. We have to consider reforming repayment so that it better supports borrowers of color, and I think that's engaging servicers, and again, some of those individual interventions that people tend to hone in on. That's really important too, as an important component. And then again, if we're talking about being economically just, if we're talking about racial equity, then I think the conversation about student loans is just as important. Not everybody has student loans, but it impacts quite a bit. And I always use the example of my immediate family, myself, my mother, and my brother. We all have student loans, but only one amongst us has a degree. Like the student loans impact people who do not have credentials, and it creates a barrier for returning or completion. So I hope that today's conversation, and it first invokes folks to go visit the Borrowers of Color page and all the resources there, but at least help to pause or stop you in your tracks and saying, hey, I didn't realize that this was connected to this, and that it's not as simple as if you take out a loan, you pay it back. I love the day that I can say zero balance. But the research and the data and the policy as it is, I may not see that day, and it wouldn't necessarily be an individual fault.
Well, there it is. There it is right there. I got to tell you, I mean, one of the, on the other side of it, I mean, you're right, though. I think that that's a reality for a lot of folks who just don't feel like they see that end in sight. I remember, some years ago, a friend invited us to a zero balance party because he had finally finished paying off his student loans.
I've been to one of those too.
I mean, he was a teacher, he had like 15,000 in student loans. He went to a state school, he did everything by the book. And this was, by the way, when he graduated with me. And so I paid $11,000 room and board and tuition all packed in one, locked in for 5 years when I was in school. Like my same institution is now in the high 20s, maybe even low 30s. I haven't checked in a little while. And that's troubling. And so I think that you're right. I think that if we start listening to folks, I mean, even listening to you, my friend and colleague right here, say like, I'm legitimately concerned I may never see the day where I have a zero balance. What is wrong with our loan system? I mean, we have to fix that. That's just, wow, Catherine.
Yeah. So, again, nuance, bringing in dignity and integrity of people of color, knowing that is an investment in ourselves, in broader society.
Right.
And a lot of people do continue to believe that, that perhaps we as our neighbors will not be so harsh with others because they made decisions that were intended to better themselves and their families.
Mm-hmm. Well, and two, I mean, it's just clear to me that if you're someone who cares about home ownership rates, if you're someone who cares about mobility in the job marketplace and making sure that companies have the upskilled talent that they need, if you're someone who cares about youth outcomes, and we know that the single greatest predictor of youth educational success is their parents' education level, you should care about this too. It's such a multi-sectional thing that, you know, as you kind of mentioned, even I think in the intro segment about, you know, really we're talking about people who have less than $20,000 worth of these loans. And if we don't do something to kind of fix this system for our current people and for future generations, I mean, we're just going to keep getting ourselves into a very large collective national hole.
You know what I think is also interesting that I don't think most folks have caught on or really see coming is the idea of financial activism that I've heard earlier this week on a student loan panel. The idea that there are some borrowers that are in protest, and how much will that spread, and what will that do to default rates, you know, implications for particular institutional types. If people are engaging in mass protests to not pay back their student loans, how is that going to impact the same institutions that serve students of color, low-income students, and whatnot? It is a continual system that, you know, we have an opportunity to pause or stop the wheel or interrupt the wheel, right? To think ahead and saying that costs are out of control, and what do we do to control the cost beyond tuition and fees? It's smart play, but also, are we running the risk of shrinking a middle class? And then are we running the risk of eliminating a middle class of people of color? Those are the types of research and kind of economic predictive modeling that I'm hoping to look at, because then it takes the conversation a little bit out of the higher education only and expands it to economic recovery, expands it to wealth building. And I think folks have been able to do that over the last 6 months.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna have you keep an eye on that story for us, and certainly as it unfolds, you know, maybe we can do something about it. But Catherine, thanks so much for really producing today's show and bringing these guests and leading us through this in-depth conversation. You've already mentioned it here, but I really suggest folks, if you want to dig into a really great collection of essays and webinars and information, check out Lumina's Borrowers of Color work, as well as the really great contributions that many of the working group members have provided. It's a great set of resources. And again, thanks, Catherine, for your work in bringing all these narratives and information to us. It's really, really helpful.
Thanks for having me. It's always a good time.
It always is. It always is. And thank you to our guests, Professor Amanda Sasheen and Amanda Martinez, for coming on today's show. Our show is produced by Catherine Riedel, Jacob Mann, John Strauss, and me, Dakota Palicki, with support from Matthew Jenkins, Mark Allen, and the team at Site Strategics. Well Done Marketing supports the promotion of our show. Deborah Humphreys and Kevin Corcoran provide leadership for Lumina's strategic engagement efforts. If you haven't yet, please be sure to subscribe and rate our show wherever you're getting your podcasts. If you have a comment or idea for an episode, reach us at luminafoundation.org or reach me on Twitter at Dakota Palicki. Thanks so much for being with us. We hope you learned something from today's conversation, and we'll definitely see you next time.